All right, I'm back. I'm sorry about that. Uh, so it goes, I guess. Anyway, kind of picking up where I left off. I think where we were going in next was to talk a little bit about what you say in terms of dominant discourses. Okay, um, when he's talking about dominant discourses, he's essentially talking about kind of the mainstream, right? And that these dominant discourses are really things that serve as pathways to uh, having access to power. Okay, different kinds of power, mind you. And we'll talk more about this when we meet and kind of come up with some examples that illustrate this. But what he's talking about really is um, when we think about kind of what access to power means within a dominant discourse in relation to a discussion about what literacy is, um, what we could kind of take from this is essentially a question about um, what does it mean to be a literate person? Okay, what counts as literacy? What counts as a form of literacy that provides access to power, right? What counts as a form of literacy that provides access to a dominant discourse or that exists in relation to a dominant discourse in ways that perpetuate it, for example, or perhaps even challenge it? So he kind of raises this question about these kind of dominant discourses, okay? But before he kind of goes into those aspects of this conversation, G gets into a discussion about differences between what it means to acquire something versus learning something. Okay, so he differentiates between um, learning and acquisition in ways that actually are important to kind of understanding what he's talking about in relation to all the kind of discourse identity stuff, as well as kind of understanding dominant discourses and also forms of power. Okay, so what he's discussing really here in terms of acquisition are often things that are subconscious, right? How do you gain understandings of things that may not be explicitly taught to you, right? Or explicitly delineated, for instance. Okay, so that these are things that you might learn, but might kind of take on, right? Either through kind of subconscious means or through just kind of broader senses of enculturation. Okay? There's things that we know how to do, but that we don't remember ever explicitly being taught how to do that, right? It just might be a particular norm that exists that we find ourselves acclimating to. Okay? G ends up kind of juxtaposing this understanding of acquisition with the idea of learning. And he talks about learning as being something that's a matter of being like explicit teaching, right? It's a process of like instruction, explanation, and then analysis. Okay, so there are certain things that we figure out and just know how to do, but then there are other things that we need to be taught explicitly how to do them, right, and what they are and why. Um, in certain regards, that positions things that we acquire as seeming natural, like they just exist. It's just how we came to understand the world. Versus being taught something, you had to kind of be explicitly taught. You had to learn something in ways that were probably sequenced in particular ways, for example. Okay, and within the kind of the one of the PDFs, one of the ones that's on there, on page 540, right, pretty early on in the article, G says that we're better at what we acquire, but we consciously know more about what we learned. Okay? So I think by that, what he's saying is that when we acquire things, they're largely invisible to us in certain regards. Versus if you're taught how to do something, right, then you know how to do it. Okay, so he kind of follows that up by saying that acquisition is good for performance, whereas learning is good for meta level knowledge. Okay, so I think we'll talk more about this in class, but there are kind of instances where we can think of, someone might be a natural at something. They just get how to do it. Like sometimes we hear that about, people with sports, for example. Oh, they're just a natural. Like they got this right away and they just know how to do it, right? Or they had an innate talent. Versus kind of being taught how to do something, okay? And that there's things that also like we acquire that kind of become automatic and we don't actually think about having to do them, for instance, okay? So the sports analogies tend to stick out for some students as ways of understanding this because we can think about things, for example, that might come naturally to us, right? That we're really good at, that we don't know how we necessarily became really good at it, but we just are. And then when we're put in a position to actually try to teach someone else about that, right? It's something that's just really natural for us. It's really hard, right? Versus kind of if you've learned something, right? If you've had someone explicitly teach you how to do something, right? There's steps that you've had explained to you about how to do something, for example, right? But if you didn't have those steps explained, it becomes more challenging to try to explain that. And that's where he's trying to kind of go with this idea of meta-level knowledge, right? Is that if you just are a natural at something, you can just do it, right? But it's hard to convey that and explain it to somebody else. But if someone taught you how to do something, right, a certain kind of vocabulary for how to explain it to somebody else and how to teach somebody else that thing, okay?